Hello everybody, welcome back to Screen Stars. I'm here today to bring you my review for the 2021 thriller film Todd, a film that is directed by Aaron Warren and it stars Hans Henke, Laura Stepman and Aaron Jackson. Now this film focuses on a character called Todd who's played by Hans Henke. Now Todd is a troubled young man, I think it's fair to say. He lost his parents 2 years previously in a car accident. He's seeing a therapist called Dr. Miller. The therapy isn't going well, I think it's fair to say. He's quite short with him, the therapist, in fact very short with him. Doesn't seem very empathetic, sympathetic, or a particularly good therapist if I'm being honest. And that could have something to do with the fact that he's struggling a little bit in his home life, I suppose. And Todd rejects his therapy and just continues to get more and more unwell. And his mental state becomes more and more fractured. He then bumps into, quite literally, Amy, who is a waitress at a local restaurant, and then Todd thinks there is some connection there and begins stalking her, and it all begins to escalate and get darker as the film progresses on. Right, so that's generally the story of Todd. What are my thoughts on this film? Well, number one, this film is a low-budget independent film. There are times when that is very, very clear when you watch this film. It does feel quite low budget, although they have made some effort. You know, for example, the therapist's office looks like a therapist's office. The restaurant where Amy works looks and functions like a restaurant. You know, so they set them scenes up well, all that kind of stuff. So you do feel some immersion while you're watching this film. The direction is interesting sometimes, especially when Todd's on screen. Some of the shots are quite manic, to match his mental state, I suppose it's fair to say. But the film to me felt a little bit overly long. You didn't get really what you would describe as a payoff here. Even though I suppose you could also argue that the ending that you get was probably more realistic than anything. But sometimes you don't watch a film to get a realistic ending. Sometimes you watch a film to get some kind of payoff. And I don't feel as though you get some kind of payoff here. And then the film does something odd. It spends the last 10 minutes or so of the film explaining away what we've just watched. And what these characters are feeling and this kind of stuff. And it didn't need it, that extra 10 minutes at the end. It really didn't need it, I personally feel. It was a well constructed film for the most part, but I didn't believe some of the characters. For example, the therapist, Dr. Miller. He was the worst therapist ever. He was literally yelling at Todd at one point. And I'm sorry, but there's not really any excuse for that. I personally don't think. And yes, you do get to see an awful lot of his life and his family life. He's struggling at home and this kind of stuff, and struggling to connect with his teenage daughter and his wife and all that kind of stuff. But still, it almost felt like you were watching two films. We were watching a film about this therapist who was, struggling. And then we had this film, well actually 3 films to some degree, and then we've got Todd's perspective, he's driving force in the film, and Amy, the waitress, but generally speaking Amy's story was more intertwined with Todd. The therapist story was more standalone, if you like, and he only really mixed with Todd when he had these sessions with him at his office and the conclusion of the film, I suppose. So it's an odd blend. It almost feels like you're watching like short stories entwined together to make one, and none of them, from my perspective, were particularly interesting. I thought the performances were okay, certainly from the 3 main cast, the therapist, Amy, and Todd. Especially Todd, I thought he did particularly well, and I think the film was trying to say more about mental health than anything else, which I applaud it for. I always like it when films try and get that message across, because mental health is very, very important, and the more people that shine a light on it and the importance of it, I'm all for that sort of thing. And I do feel the film did that. I just don't feel as though the film was compelling enough, interesting enough, and it just didn't draw you in enough. The story, you didn't feel real fear for some of these characters, especially when Todd was in his stalking mode. You never really felt like the characters were at any real risk, or Todd was ever really going to cross a line, or I don't know. It just didn't feel tense for a thriller. And I think, regardless of what payoff you get at the end of the film, you got to make your audience feel that tension early on in the film, that something could potentially explode here. And I never really got that, if I'm being particularly honest. Now, Michael Winslow's in this film. Now, if that name sounds familiar, that's the guy from the Police Academy films. The guy who did all the sound effects. It took me a while to figure out who he was, and he's only in the film a couple of times, and he's the barman. Now, when the therapist goes at the end of the day after his hard day at work, he goes into the local bar and chats to the barman about what difficult a day he's had, and that barman was Michael Winslow. It was a pointless cameo, I suppose. He's barely in the film, and I suppose it's a name to put on your cover, I suppose, but he is no way intertwined with the plot of the film, I would suggest. So I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 10. It's flawed, but I liked the idea. So maybe something to check out if it's the sort of thriller that you're interested in, but I do think you'll probably find it particularly flawed. So 4 out of 10 from me, maybe 1 to give a miss, this one. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the review. I hope you found it useful, and of course I'll be back with more content and reviews on Screen Stars very, very soon.